The essay I used for my research guide was my essay titled Antigone, a Vehicle for Examining War and Otherness. The essay was written for my English 5322 class with Dr. Jayasuriya, her literature and culture course. And the course itself focused on war and terrorism, and we read a lot of novels from different countries that focused on different wars. For example, we read Chimamanda Adichie's Half of a Yellow Sun, which looked at the Biafran conflict in Africa. We read Reluctant Fundamentalist, which looked at following September 11th from the point of view of a Muslim man. We read Soza Boy, which also is about the Biafran conflict. We read Michael Ondaatje's Anil's Ghost, which is about Sri Lanka, and as well as another novel, Story of a Brief Marriage, which is also about Sri Lanka. Particularly for my essay, I focused on some modern adaptations of Antigone that we read. Those adaptations were The Watch by Joydeep Roy Bhattacharya, as well as Home Fire by Camilla Shamsi. My goal in my essay was to address the question, why do texts such as Antigone foster an ethics of resistance? Why do they go along with war, with trying to resist the opposing side and stand for what you believe in? I aimed to investigate how the underdog comes into play in Antigone and its adaptations, as well as why Antigone is a compelling protagonist. So, in other words, why is it interesting to us to read about someone who's standing alone, who doesn't have a lot of people backing them, and their success in that? And my overall goal was to investigate these two questions so that I could address the ways in which Antigone serves as a mode of discussing viewpoints between two conflicting sides, particularly utilizing the novels The Watch and Home Fire. So, to get you to understand the background of my paper, I'm going to start by giving summaries of the novels. So, Antigone was a play written by Sophocles, and it's the third part of the Theban plays, which includes Oedipus Rex, Oedipus at Colonus, and then Antigone is the third part of that. And Antigone picks up where Oedipus at Colonus leaves off. Your main character in the play is Antigone, who is Oedipus's daughter. If you're unaware of what happens in Oedipus, I highly encourage going back and reading the play because that play itself is really interesting. But anyway, so Antigone goes back to Thebes to try to stop a prophecy that her brothers Eteocles and Polynices will kill each other over the throne that Oedipus has left behind. And when she gets there, she finds that they've already killed each other. And through order of her uncle Creon, who's kind of who's running things at the moment, who's king in charge, he orders that Eteocles can have a proper burial, whereas she finds that Polynices is not getting a proper burial and that his body has just been left out to rot. And so Antigone's goal becomes to get Polynices' body and give him a proper burial. So then The Watch is a novel by Joydeep Roy Bhattacharya. It was written in 2012. It's set in the early days of the Afghanistan war when we first invaded Afghanistan, and it follows a gruesome night of fighting between American soldiers and Afghanistan fighters. And the novel opens up with a young Afghanistan woman named Nizam coming to the base to ask for the body of her brother back so that she can give him a proper burial because the Americans are holding him on the base and are going to send him to a different part of Afghanistan because he was believed to be a terrorist leader. The novel itself explores several different voices, including Nizam, with, like I said, who the novel opens. It looks at Masood, an Afghanistan interpreter who works for the Americans, which is interesting because Masood kind of serves as your Ismeni, where Nizam is your Antigone. So through Masood's point of view, you get the point of view of the Afghani whose life has been overturned or upturned by the Taliban, whereas Nizam's life has been turned upside down by the Americans, who in their bombing of certain cities ended up killing her entire family, which is why her brother goes to fight back the Americans in that raid. It also follows the American soldiers and bounces around between them, and they kind of serve as your chorus in this novel. So, what The Watch does is it encourages the reader to take into account Nizam's humanity, while the American soldiers attempt to respond to her presence, which makes them uneasy, and they're kind of dealing with her demands and what they mean to them, and it's making them question what is right and wrong in this sense. Then Home Fire is a novel by Kamila Shamsi. It's a very recent novel. It just came out in 2017. It's set in London, and it kind of has bits that are set in Pakistan. And it follows the lives of a British Pakistani family, which are the siblings Isma, Anika, and Pavez Pasha, as well as father and son Karamat Lone and Iman. If you kind of look at the names, you can kind of figure out who's who. But Isma is the oldest sister that's representative of Ismeni. Anika is the younger sister who's twins with Pavaz. And Anika is Antigone, and then Pavaz would be Polynices. And then you have Karamat Lone, who serves as Creon, and then Iman, which serves as Anika's and Antigone's fiance, Haman. So the reader, through the novel, learns of the Pasha family's tainted past through terrorism through their father, and their currently unraveling present. And the reader watches as Anika tries to bring her brother Parvaz back home. The interesting thing to note here is that Parvaz is not dead yet, and he's just been taken to Pakistan to become a jihadi, only he's learned that this isn't the future he wants for himself. And what Home Fire reflects on really is homegrown terrorism and how young men in London were targeted to become terrorists, and it kind of explores the tactics that the jihadis used to entice these young men and bring them onto their side. So, to kind of set the stage for my discussion of those novels in relation to Antigone and why they used Antigone in the first place, I first discussed some previous adaptations. The first one I discussed was Alain Destendau's Antigone Vietnam, which was written and performed for Hue Vietnam's Hue Festival. And it utilizes Antigone to reflect on the patriarchal control of the law, meaning the male control of the law, and it seeks to honor the enduring strength of women in Vietnamese society. Two other adaptations that I looked at were Antigone adaptations by Walter Hassenkleber and Bertolt Brecht, which are two separate Antigones which both reflect on a war-torn Germany. One looks at it as a post-World War I, and the second one looks at it as an approaching World War II novel, which is interesting because it one of them is set actually in World War II, and it opens with two young Jewish women. And what these two plays are attempting to do is to define the moral responsibility in terms of the German nation at war. And they use the Antigone story of Sophocles to sound a warning to the German people that lusting for power would eventually destroy the state. So they're just trying to make the German people aware of what's going on with power and how it's affecting them. And then after I discussed the previous plays, I looked at an NPR interview of Syrian refugee women who had adapted Antigone recently. And these women are living in Beirut, Lebanon as refugees, and they spoke with a reporter about how they felt that Antigone was representative of their own tragedies. So war trauma can be challenging in the meaning that after you've experienced that type of trauma, the victims have a hard time trying to make sense of their experiences and make meaning of life. So literature enables people to work through the pain and wounds brought on by these traumatic events by providing them with the space for working through that memory and for self-examination and retrospection and flashbacks. And so these Syrian refugee women in Beirut found that the Antigone Project was a way for them to deal with their trauma, because they related to Antigone in the sense that they lost their family members and they couldn't bury them, and they felt that that was their responsibility, so they carried that weight of their families on their shoulders. So finally, I examined why these novels utilize Antigone. So the reason I thought that Bhattacharya and Shamsi utilized Antigone to look at terrorism and to look at the war in the Middle East was because Western culture and Western civilization is largely influenced by Greece, including our language, our philosophy, and our literature. A lot of our canonical literature, early canonical literature, comes from Sophocles, Aristotle, and so on. So, by referencing a familiar Greek text, these two authors are making these stories accessible to Western readers who normally view the Middle East as other, as uncivilized, as full of terrorists, by taking into account the ways in which we are tied to and alienated from our own culture. Meaning, yes, we're aware of the Greek influence, but the language itself, for example, is lost on us. A lot of the religion itself is lost on us now, because that's not a language we speak anymore, and those aren't really religions we follow anymore. So what Antigone does in this sense is it serves as a bait to lure in the Western reader, and then I close out by examining Antigone and these two novels in depth, side by side, by comparing scenes that are related. So finally, some challenges that I faced. I felt there was one really big challenge I faced when writing this paper, and that was synthesizing the information between my three sections. When writing them, they all seemed really interdependent, and I had the hardest time figuring out how I could connect them. And in retrospect, I understand that I needed to talk more on why, like Alain de Stendhal, why he used Antigone, and how it served as a vehicle for bringing in the Western reader, because that was specifically why he utilized that, was because for Western audiences that were attending the festival, it made this issue more accessible to them, and that's something I feel I really could have brought in better, and that I didn't do as well as I could have. And that's basically my paper. Thank you for listening.